So, hello and welcome everybody to our webinar, Mental Health in a Time of Climate Crisis. Thank you all for taking the time to come along to our webinar this evening. My name's Kate Wiley, I'm a GP, I'm in Adelaide, and I would just like to acknowledge before we start that we meet today on Aboriginal land. First Nations people have never ceded sovereignty of their land, and respect is owed to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations and people. I'm on Kaurna land. Greetings to a group of people in Ghana is Ngamani. So Ngamani to you all. I do think it's a sign of respect if you write the name of the land that you are on in the chat. What I'd also like to acknowledge, though, is that we are in a time of climate crisis. You know, we are in the Pyrocene, we are in the 6th great mass extinction event of our planet's history. We are alive at the most important decade of human history, which is, you know, a really massive sentence to say. But, you know, all of us here, I think, know that this is our last decade. This is our last sort of real chance to change the future. This is the decade where we have to halve global emissions, where we have to change our paradigm from a nature destroying to a nature restoring world. And, you know, I don't think there's anybody who can look the climate crisis dead in the eye without feeling psychological distress from that. You know, because this is big and overwhelming and hard. And, you know, like, I know that I have lots of emotions around the climate crisis. I have moments of incandescent rage. I have moments of overwhelming despair and sadness. I also have times of denial where somehow I can kind of turn it off for a little while just to, you know, have a normal life. And I think that everybody experiences these. You know, I don't think I'm unique in this. I think all of us have these problems. And so tonight's webinar about mental health is really to acknowledge the collective climate distress that we have, you know, to see what we can do to support each other as climate aware practitioners, and also about, you know, supporting our patients, because obviously as the climate crisis deepens, we are going to come across more and more people suffering from climate distress. So I'm very privileged to have joining me tonight two doctors who are part of this movement, who really recognise the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. The first one I'll introduce is Grant Blashki. Hi Grant, how are you?
Hi.
Hi. I've got some formal things about you. Grant is a practicing GP. He's the lead clinical advisor for Beyond Blue. He's an associate professor at the Nossal Institute for Global Health and the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, adjunct at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, a writer in resident at Future Leaders Books. He's a renowned researcher, and his main research themes are mental health, environmental health, and global health. Grant, you're also a co-founder of Doctors for the Environment when we started 20 years ago in Adelaide. So, you know, that makes you a very important part of our organisation. And I'd also like to introduce Anna. Hello, Anna. Anna is also a GP. She practices in southern Tasmania. She's got a big interest in mental health, especially youth mental health. She's a clinical lecturer at the University of Tasmania. And Anna co-founded the Climate Resilience Network, which, you know, really looks at this problem and convenes Doctors for the Environment Mental Health Working Group, which any DEA member is very welcome to join. Yes, and obviously Anna is passionate about us understanding the mental health effects of climate change. So I think today what we'll do is we'll get Grant to sort of start speaking, and then, you know, let's see how it flows. I think Anna and Denise, if you want to sort of, you know, ask questions or have things that you want to add to anything that Grant says, I think that would be quite appropriate. We do have, you know, like just as a starting point, I suppose, Grant, if you'd like to just sort of talk about some overviews of the mental health effects of climate change and start us off from there.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and thank you to all the DEA people for organising everything. And thanks also to everyone online. We've all got a lot on our plate at the moment. If you're not in lockdown or, you're managing the fun and games of the pandemic. So tonight, this is not going to be a doomsday talk, but it's also not going to be like a Pollyanna talk that everything's fine and we don't have to worry about it either. So I hope we get the balance right and that pick up some useful bits and pieces and contribute to the discussion. So I think a good place to start for me is just with some of the brutal facts, I guess. And for me, the CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, State of the Climate report is a good place to start to just have a look at what's going on in Australia. Many of you will know this, but according to their report, we're 1.44 degrees above what we were in 1910 in Australia. We've had a 16% drop in rainfall in the southwest of Australia since the 1970s. A lot of the warming's gone into the ocean and it's warmed over a degree since 1900, and that heat is going to sit there and cause us some grief. The Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets continue to just lose a substantial amount of water and are contributing to sea level rise. And we know that sea level around Australia is 25 centimetres up since 1880, which is quite significant. And meantime, we've got ocean acidification. So that's a fun bunch of things happening in the world. But as I think we all do, I mean, there's a smart bunch of medical people who are used to dealing with brutal facts sometimes with our patients. And we've all sort of got more or less a science degree when we did our medical degree. And, we understand that these facts are a bit of a worry, I run a master's course at Melbourne Uni called Planetary and Global Health. And it's like my annual inoculation from the smart climate science people like David Caroli, who I call the scariest man in the universe. He comes in and you have a look at those graphs again, and a little bit like Kate was saying, you sort of fall back into denial. Oh, it can't be that bad. And then you're like, oh, it's pretty bad. It's pretty not good. And then I think also, a lot of this was sort of future projection when we was talking, when DA was starting. And, now so much of it seems to be unraveling before our eyes. We're seeing trouble in America and Canada having, off the charts heat, and floods in Europe. And so it's becoming not a sort of future theoretical model thing and a actual thing. So then you start thinking, what actions are happening? And I think, as Kate said, this is a pretty important decade. We're aiming to get zero emissions by 2050 to have even a chance of avoiding some of the worst impacts. And we know if we just let it roll that we're probably going to head for 3 or 4 degrees, which is going to be serious trouble. And I think, anyone who is sort of brave enough to be looking at it is going, this ain't great, right? Meanwhile, greenhouse gases concentration 410 parts per million, or CO2 equivalent 508 parts per million, hasn't been this high for 2 million years. So what do Australians think about all this? And I think one thing I've noticed with this COVID pandemic, there's a lot of magical thinking that goes on out there. Looking at UK with Freedom Day, and you're like, good luck with that, right? Like, you vaccinated everyone and we're free, we're out the other side. It's magic. And I think, as human beings, all of us, me included, we can get into a bit of magical thinking and, wishful thinking. But I like the Australian Institute's Climate of the Nation report in 2020. I thought that was quite a good summary of where Australians are at, and 82% of people are concerned that climate change is going to cause more bushfires. 83% want coal-fired power stations phased out. Only 12% of Australians reckon we need a gas-led recovery, 59% want renewables. 71% of Australians want Australia to be a global leader in climate change. Hilarious. right? It's like the guy at the back of the peloton in the Tour de France going, oh, just deciding if I'm going to be a leader of the peloton. Well, Matt, you just got to catch up to the peloton before we decide you're going to be a leader, right?
We're all in it together, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I don't think it's going to happen. More than 2 out of Australians want Australia to have a national target of net zero by 2050. But it seems like our new leader of the deputy leaders just wants to get a bit more information before we you know, think about whether we need zero emissions. Meanwhile, I see in the Age today, Minister Lay is going to actively challenge the idea about you know, ministers being responsible for the future climate of future generations. Great. And in the Climate Change Performance Index, we love to win Australia, and we're almost down the bottom of climate policy. I think we're 6th lowest out of 57 countries. So fun times for Australia. Just a step back, and I think this concept that is often talked about called planetary boundaries is become quite popular. And, you know, the Lancet did a commission called Planetary Boundaries. And this was really brought to the fore recently by Johan Rockström. And for those of you who haven't had a look at it, I think it's quite good on Netflix, the David Attenborough documentary with Johan Rockström called Breaking Boundaries. It's actually really, it's pretty much their Lancet Commission report with better infographics, you know, and you can get a sense that human beings at this time in the history are in the Anthropocene, where we are one of the most powerful forces on the planet, and various life support systems are being pushed to their limits, be it biodiversity or fresh water or overfishing, deforestation, and climate's one of those, right? So it sort of has a context. It's not like we fix the climate issue and everything else can just go away. So what about mental health? So I've been working at Beyond Blue for some time, and you know, the human psyche, unfortunately, is pretty fragile. You know, we spend a lot of time helping a lot of vulnerable people in the community. And as I often say to my students, most of us just have to think about our family or our friends or our Christmas barbecue, whatever it is, and you'll know a bunch of people who are really grappling with their mental health. Australian Institute of Health and Welfare tells us in a year, on average, about 2 million people have an anxiety condition, about 1 million people have depression. It's not rare stuff. Or the big global burden of disease study that some of you might know of, where they sort of try and rate how much disability each disease category causes. And mental health gets Guernsey up high there, 7% of the global burden of disease, 19% of all the, what we call DALYs, disability adjusted life years. So, you know, mental health is really important. It's something we're grappling with anyway. And a proportion of the population now are really quite worried about the climate, or what we call eco anxiety or climate anxiety, particularly some of the young people. So to my mind, this is just such an important area. And what I'd like to go on and just talk about, if this works well, Kate, or we can come back to it, is what are some of the ways that climate change actually impacts on mental health? And then I also want to talk about what are some strategies that we can use. Just in terms of your process, do you want me to just plow on, or did you want me to stop and just have a bit of a chat and see if there's questions?
I just want to comment a little bit on your introduction. One of the things you said there about the Australian Institute report that just shows that all of us are concerned about climate change. You know, we don't have to think of it as a fringe issue for people. I think that that's an important thing to remember, because somehow it's the elephant in the room that people don't acknowledge, and actually we are all worried. Yeah,
those figures in the 80%, and that's a huge change. I mean, honestly, I remember I was involved with some of those Al Gore climate change presentations, and in some ways, you know, many of those back in, when did we start them, 2006 or so, they were sort of like, hey, guess what? There's a problem with the climate. Really? You know,
Yeah.
but that's not where we're at. Like most.
No, I think we're at a moment of accelerating change, and we can really see it, you know, like the heat dome over Canada, you know, the floods in Germany. I think, you know, it's escalating so quickly in front of us, which is why obviously we're all, you know, very distressed and worried about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'd really like to hear about what you consider the mental health impacts are,
Yeah.
and yeah, some response strategies to deal with them.
Yeah, look, I mean, I tend to think of it, and we've written quite a lot about it in three main categories, and it depends how you want to divide it up, but there's all your direct effects, okay? If you're the bunny caught in the way of a fire or a flood or a heat wave, like, and you've been through a terrible time, that can affect your mental health. So on our Beyond Blue, we have a podcast called Not Alone, which has got some amazing interviews with people. And there's one with Cliff, who was a volunteer firefighter in the Black Saturday fires. And it really gives you insight to sort of the fallout, not just for the community, but, you know, the workers and the people who are caught up in an extreme weather event like the crazy fires we had in Australia. And we do see long-term fallout, you know, post-traumatic stress problems, anxiety conditions, substance abuse, relationships breaking down, intimate partner violence. All these things get amplified when people get caught up in these sort of events. So there's these direct effects, but probably at least as important, and in terms of the scale of it, the indirect effects are huge, you know. So loss of livelihood. So if your tourism goes down the toilet because everything's burnt down, or there's your barrier reef is bleached and you're not having people come in, whatever that is, displacement. And there's displacement of a large scale, like in, you know, Tuvalu and Kiribati, where they're literally planning in their annual report where the hell are we going to live as the sea level comes up. But even, you know, in Australia, there are areas that are becoming uninsurable and communities not really seeing a great future, kids moving out to the city. So, you know, these things happen. There's evidence around conflict, at least in a global sense. You know, there's quite a lot of work around, was the whole Syrian refugee problem or an element of that, you know, fueled by environmental problems under the surface, you know, fighting over water and drying lands and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of indirect flow-on effects on community, which are really hard to measure, but can be huge, as we saw during the fires. And then the third category I'll talk about, so we talked about direct, the indirect, and I wanted to talk about the overarching, right? So overarching is things like compassion for people who are affected. I mean, many of us are doctors, health professionals, you know, where, you know, sense it, you see stuff going on. I mean, we all saw those fires and you think that looks bloody awful and you feel for them, you know. We're obviously a self-selecting group, like who sits around on a Thursday night going, you know, there's enough going on in the world, but I think I'll hear Dr. Blashki bang on about mental health and climate change, right? So we're like a self-selecting group, but often a sensitive, you know, compassionate group who are actually worried about other people in the world. And when you see what's going on, it's really upsetting. I think more generally, this worry about future generations really came to the fore with people like Greta Thunberg, and many of my young patients have absolutely, climate change is up high on their list. I know the Mission Australia report, which is pretty amazing. They look at youth in Australia, 20,000 kids. I think it's age 14 to early 20s. And the top three things are mental health, environment, and social justice. And environment popped up from about 8th to 2nd. So, you know, the young people are really aware of this and thinking, what on earth do you guys think you're doing? And on a personal note, I'm very excited to be expecting our first grandchild at the end of the year, which is extremely exciting. But but it has, you know, when I was running the masters the last few weeks, I'm going 2050. Oh shit, this little one, God willing, is 29. It's not, you know, or 2100. That could be in the life of this little one at 79. So, you know, some of these sort of far off in the future figures suddenly feel a bit more real and relevant, which is, you know, again, concern for the future. And then I think the solastalgia, which is that word coined by Glenn Albrecht about, you know, mourning loss of place and loss of nature. And again, in a fairly environmentally sort of aware group like this, who are often big lovers of nature and being out. You know, I remember going to the Tasmanian forests, Anna, and honestly, you know, where some of the logging was done, I felt like I'd walked into the bad book of the bad part of the Lorax. You know, like you just go, what the hell's going on here, right? Yeah. So that's, you know, that's the way I think a little bit, and that's not comprehensive, but I think if you're thinking about, okay, direct effects, indirect effects, these overarching type effects. And I might just pause there for a sec before we talk a bit about what do you do with all this, right?
Yeah. I think Anna might like to add something there.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. That's a fantastic overview. I just wanted to add a couple of my thoughts on that as well. Just going back to those direct impacts. We talked about the impacts of extreme weather events. I also wanted to just allude to the impacts of heat also, that as humans, we do not feel well when we get overheated. And there's, you know, robust evidence that shows increase in aggression and distress and emergency department presentations with distress in relation to heat. There's some evidence currently being looked at by some of our colleagues within DEA in the Sydney Children's Hospital Network that's investigating the gradual rise of presentations to emergency departments with self-harm in children and young people over the last decade. And they're looking into whether that may be in any way associated with a rise in heat. Some of our members will be aware of research done by Professor Helen Berry, which shows that for increased mean average temperatures, I think there is an increased rate of suicide in most Australian states and territories, which is really, really horrifying. Interestingly, the converse is actually true in Tasmania. Maybe that's because we're generally so cold. So when it warms up a little bit, that actually lessens psychological distress for Tasmanians. And I think that's the case in ACT as well. The other thing I wanted to talk about with the direct impacts, and I think is really relevant to what we've seen in this last bit of time, is compounding disasters. So we're going to see this increasing pace and frequency of the intensity of our extreme weather events. And we've seen that in parts of the country with the bushfire, flood, COVID. There's much less time to repair and rebuild psychologically, you know, not just talking about the infrastructure. And we know that the psychological impacts of extreme weather events outweigh the physical impacts by about 40 to 1 and have a really long tail. Probably a lot of us on here tonight are GPs, and we're going to be dealing with those impacts for years to come in those communities. The other thing, just to go back to what we were talking, if I can have a moment to share with you some new data, which is not yet published, but I've got permission from the lead authors to share with you. We were talking about overall concern amongst Australians. And there's some interesting data that looks at how that concern compares to concern about COVID in the recent past. Because one might think COVID's been the more immediate pressing concern, and that might have pushed other things to the side. But research by Rebecca Patrick and Tristan Snell at Deakin University indicates that that really isn't the case. So they surveyed about 5,500 Australians between August and November last year, and found that about 66% of people considered climate change to be very much an issue for them personally, as opposed to 25% for COVID. And wanted to highlight there also that actually the most concerned age group were the 35 to 45-year-olds. or 34 to 44-year-olds, which struck a chord for me as a parent. I certainly often spend time worrying about the future for my children who are aged 5 and 1. And I wonder if that's what that demographic represents. Anyway, I just wanted to add those comments, and I'll hand back over to you, Grant. Thank you.
Oh, good on you, Anna. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing about COVID versus climate. I think that's pretty pertinent. Grant, I think we do need to talk about how we address these problems that we're facing, obviously. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A which I want to make sure we get to. Would you like to just start off with some overarching concepts and then
I saw
those questions particularly?
There's 2 excellent comments there about people feeling so despondent they feel suicidal. Another question I think there from John about how direct should you be in communicating this. If I can just park those and we'll come back to them and we'll just talk about an overarching approach, and then we'll deal with those couple of issues, which I think are really good questions.
Okay.
So look, I don't have any magic wand, which, you know, as GPs, we're often sitting there and patients going, oh, what are you going to, I don't know, a magic wand, right? But here's a couple of ideas and ways that I think about this that I found helpful with my patients and my colleagues over the years. And I've got sort of 5 areas I'm going to talk about: managing feelings, managing the thoughts, managing the hope budget, managing your actions, and what we call meaning-focused coping. All right. So I'll just walk you through these. Let's start with managing feelings. First thing is acknowledge it. And, you know, I've been doing a lot of the media for COVID at the moment on the various TV stations and things. And when I was doing it a year ago, I was saying, you know, cheer up, we're getting through this, that we'll find a vaccine, don't worry, right? Which I'm still hopeful, but I also think we need to say, not sugarcoat it for people and go, it's pretty shit at the moment. It's actually not that fun. And we're not exactly sure where all this is going to land, and say, that's okay. You know, if you're feeling agitated and annoyed about it, that's all right. So I think in terms of climate, it's okay to be feeling a bit sad or worried about the future or angry about government actions. And however that you find helpful to express that. Maybe you want to keep a diary, maybe it's a lot and you want to speak to a mental health professional. You know, I go for clinical supervision for all my sort of counselling and Beyond Blue work, and we'll often talk about, you know, those feelings, and it's quite good to speak to someone objective at times. So that's something to think about. And also to validate it and go, look, it is a big deal. Like historically, we haven't really quite seen something like this. You know, a lot of the baby boomers have had a pretty good run since Second World War, and they're like, yeah, it's all going to be all right. And then we're like, oh, this wasn't in the game plan. What's going on here, right? I think it's really important, as per the name of our Beyond Blue podcast, not to deal with it on your own. And that sense of loneliness or feeling like you've got to be a hero about it all is not that helpful. It's much better. I get a lot of strength and hope from speaking to other people, and you realize, look, I'm not mad worrying about this. This is actually pretty serious. Be self-compassionate, especially if you're working in advocacy. So over the years, you know, I was a board director for Australian Conservation Foundation or been involved with various advocacy groups. You've got to look after your people who are working on this area, and that they don't get sort of overwhelmed by it all. They understand when to back off. And as I mentioned, alluded to a bit earlier, I do think there's great gains in spending time in nature and actually just connecting in. For me, it's being out in a kayak, and, you know, I love that. And I'm sure most of the people here have got their own little version of that. So, you know, with the feelings, I think that's really important, just to acknowledge them. And it is sad and it is worrying, and you can feel angry about it. So being an advocate of a psychological technique called cognitive behavioural therapy, it's been running courses for GPs on this for about 20 years. And a lot of the evidence, you know, we've got loads of evidence at Beyond Blue. We have a guide to what works for anxiety, guide to what works for depression. And cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, love it or hate it, has really good evidence that it helps people feel better and cope better and whatever outcomes you look at. So the principle of it, for those of you who haven't had much to do with psychology stuff, it looks at the way you're thinking about things, and it asks you to try and identify errors in the way you're thinking and to try and replace those with more realistic or fairer ways of thinking. That's a pretty quick summary of CBT. It's more complicated, but that's the basic idea. So I want to talk to you about common thinking errors that we all do, right? You don't have to have that depression or anxiety. So all or nothing thinking, right? That you'll see with a lot of your depressed or anxious patients. It's all or nothing. Either I'm, you know, got into my uni course or I'm a complete failure, like that sort of thinking. So we can do that with climate. We can go, well, we either solve the climate problem or we don't, right? But the truth is there are shades of grey. You know, thinking in shades of grey, things like slowing the rate of climate change is worthwhile, even if we don't head off 2 degrees. Like 2 degrees is going to be a lot better than 4 degrees. So I think that that's really important. I think there's some black and white thinking there about the capacity of people to change. And so, you know, when you look at this in a rigid way and you go, people aren't going to change, they're selfish, they're hopeless, we're never going to get this. And actually, if you look at history, there's lots of great examples of dramatic changes in human civilization, be it slavery, women getting the vote, even the incredible technological change. I think another one that's a bit tricky, but there is, you know, amongst the environmental world, overrepresented with people that think they're going to save the planet personally, right? And it's got a sort of a grandiose flavor to it, like, oh, but I'm, you know, and they pop up every now and then. But I've been around the game long enough to know, like, even if you're Obama or someone immensely powerful, like no single person is going to actually save the planet. And the reality is most of us have to find our little piece of the puzzle, the bit that we can do with our skills, our networks, our ways of doing things.
Can I just interject there?
Yeah, go for it.
I just want to say, I think that's actually an extremely important thing to say to people. You know, if you can say that, yes, I acknowledge your despair, and yes, I acknowledge that it's hard, and we all want to save the planet, but we can all do our bit to save it collectively. You know, that collective action is really powerful. Humans, if we work in concert, we do great things. And every little thing that we do is one piece of the puzzle. You know, and like, if I do something, I'm doing it. And if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done. Yeah. So let's all just do something, you know, let's try. And you know, and that sense of it's not, and I really like what you're saying about black and white. It isn't absolute. It isn't we save it or we don't. It's degrees, you know, and you know, like
it can dovetail into a sort of like quite grandiose, you know, sort of thing, which we will see as well. Sometimes in our patients, you'll see someone that their grandiosity is linked into the fact that they're the one saving the planet, apparently.
Yeah.
You know? But we actually need mature people who understand, well, I can really help in this bit. So I'm going to do this bit really well, you know. Anyway, I don't want to be too soapboxy about it, but that's something I've observed. And by the way, the people who are sort of grandiose and save the planet end up about 2 years later completely disillusioned and say, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. I've got a new project, because you hit the real walls. So I just mentioned that. Closely aligned to that, I think another, if you like, sort of common faulty thought is that idea that people are good or bad, right? You know, if it was only those evil fossil fuel people listen to us pious doctors, then the world would be great, you know. But the truth is that it's not that black and white. Most of us have been benefiting from fossil fuels to some extent in our lives. And we do need to bring people with us, and we do need a just transition to bring, you know, the coal industry people and people in those towns and, you know, business people along with us. Now, there are some crazy, evil people out there, don't get me wrong. And there's some people with, you know, vested interests where you think you've got to be joking. What are you thinking, right? So yes, we have those, but I also think there's a lot of people where we've just got to not think in black and white terms. So there's a bit of that. The other one I'll just mention, and there's more of these, but a common sort of thinking error we talk about in CBT is should and must statements. And that's got a sort of a guilty vibe to it. So you see that in a lot of your depressed places. You know, I should visit my mother every day. I should have done this. I must do that. And I think the trick with that is to focus a bit now on the here and now and the future. Like there's all of us can find things that we think, oh God, I could have done that a bit better. I should have done that. I should have done that. But that if that's paralyzing, it's not helpful. Like we actually want people to go, well, here we are now, not about climate change for 45 years or whatever it is. And what can we do? So I think that there is gains. If you like this sort of CBT stuff, I like a practical book called Change Your Thinking by Sarah Edelman, which sort of explains CBT. And I find it really helpful in clinical practice as well. As I said, I run courses for GPs every year on, you know, how to manage common mental health issues.
Yeah.
So before I jump into my discussion about hope, just want to see if there's any questions or comments on what we've talked about so far.
I think Anna's got something she'd like to add.
Thanks. Yeah, I just thought as a bit of a kind of a counterpoint to discussion about cognitive behavioral therapy, might also be interesting to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy application to this. So those of you who are familiar with psychological strategies, I'm sure there's lots of us listening who would also be familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, which is another type of cognitive therapy. It's still dealing with thoughts and feelings and behaviors, but it perhaps looks at it from a slightly different angle. And I think different things work for different people, and it's about finding the strategies that work for you. And there's a lot of commonality. So I think, the ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy in a nutshell, basically open up to what's actually happening, be present in the here and now, and do what matters. So what I find useful in talking about acceptance and commitment therapy in this space is it's connecting our emotional experience to our values and our action. So obviously we have to actually accept that what our emotions are without trying to push them away and go into denial or hold on to them too tightly and end up, sort of in despair or turning to drink or whatever, or marathon Netflix binges where you don't want to think about it, or whatever it is that you do. We want to be able to accept these really unpleasant, uncomfortable emotions that we don't want to have, but they're there. And as we've touched on, they're entirely valid. It is normal to be despairing. It is normal to be sad about what is happening to our planet. And I don't think we can overstate that enough. It's also really powerful to share that collectively, because we spend a lot of time not being able to talk about this. A lot of our feelings of despair and disappointment about climate are disenfranchised. We don't really have an avenue to talk about that in society. And we often, have to self-censor. As doctors, we often might be self-censoring because we don't want people to think that we're fringe or out there strange. But as we've seen, actually it's a majority concern. So we need to accept it. We need to be present to reality. That's where sort of mindfulness and grounding come in. But importantly, we need to listen to what those feelings are telling us. We feel angry because we care about justice. We feel grief because we love the world. And then we need to turn that and pivot into action, which I think is the really beautiful part about acceptance and commitment therapy. Also, the fact that we can consider our values, which are different from our goals. So if I value showing up for the planet and doing what I can in the here and now to the best of my ability, I can hold that regardless of whether I win or lose a campaign, regardless of whether Susan Lay decides that they're going to challenge their responsibility to actually care for future generations. I still show up and do the best that I can because it's the right thing to do. And for me, doing nothing is not acceptable. So I think those concepts in ACT are really powerful. But I think Yep, there's lots of different ways to skin a cat of climate distress. The common themes. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Anna. And I just want to add on to this. I put a link in the chat about to the Australian Psychological Society's stuff on Activate, which is their acronym on that. And the A is for acknowledging feelings. And I find this a very helpful link to give to patients and look at myself around, you know, how we need to acknowledge that it's there because we don't have time for denial, because we do need action. And, you know, certain ways of looking after ourselves. So, okay. And so, yeah, Grant, can you come?
Yeah.
Give us the next bit.
Okay, this is a great conversation. That was excellent, Anna. So I have to mention that. And I think if I jump to my little fifth thing I was going to talk about, which is this meaning-focused coping, because I think I really like what you talked about, values, because this is a bit of a marathon, this thing. And there are a lot of bumps along the way. You know, I remember like some years ago when we got the price on carbon and like, oh, okay, we're getting somewhere. And then it was like, bam, no, we don't anymore. We're the first country to get rid of a price on carbon. And so I think if you haven't got that resilience, the values about why you're doing this, and people's values, as you know, wherever they come from, whether it's faith-based or humanism or whatever spiritual sense they have, that's a great place to come from, because it has you can deal with the bumps along the way, as you say, like whatever comes your way. There are a couple of other things I want to talk about, and I think we've got to talk a bit about hope.
Yeah.
And hope gets thrown around like, but I'm still hopeful. And I must say, you know, one of the things I always find hard is if you see a presentation about climate stuff and then the last 30 seconds are about hope, and, you know, everyone walks out feeling terrible. So there is a sort of a taxonomy that's evolved around hope. So there's per Epsom Stokes has written some good frameworks around this that I like. There's the naively optimistic, the Pollyanna thinking, like, oh, it's all going to work out. It's magically just going to fix itself, right? Maybe. Stoically optimistic, which is sort of that idea of there's no end to human ingenuity. You know, we're going to make it happen just when we need to. There's active skepticism, where you're realistic about the, you know, the unlikeliness of there being just a simple solution, but a willingness to do what we can do. And the one which I find most helpful is what's been called grounded hope, which is got other names similar to Joanne Macy talks about active hope, or Susie Moser talks about authentic hope, or Bill McKibben talks about mature hope. But they're in this same category, which is around telling the truth about what's actually going on. And how do we hold in mind like the truth about what's going on and still feel motivated to do our work and to advocate for real change. So it is this balancing act, I think, between hope and despair. The other thing I would say is this is an unusual sort of anxiety, because a lot of the anxiety we deal with in general practice is helping people to deal with an unrealistic worry. Do you know what I mean? So the answer is, oh, well, no, we need to actually look, and no, look, it's okay. You don't need to wash your hands that many times. It's okay. You know, that's where we're going. Whereas that sort of answer here would not be the right answer. It needs to acknowledge the worry, but also hopefully result in some real actions that make a difference. So before I go into actions, I just wanted to see if there's any other comments. We've got a lot on Q&A, Kate.
Yeah, we do have a number of questions there that we haven't really sort of looked at.
Why don't we go to those for a minute, and then we'll come back to actions. So,
all right, I can read it out to you if you like.
Well, yeah, yeah, you go for it if you like.
Okay. So the first one I think we should ask: how do you deal with people who are consciously or subconsciously suicidal because the world is or will not be worth living in?
So, gee, that's a tough.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but it's a pretty real scenario.
maybe I can just make a couple of comments there. And I should say, like, if this is super unsettling, this session, for anyone, that they should feel free to call Beyond Blue, or if they're feeling really at risk, calling Lifeline. And, you know, because it's pretty heavy stuff we're dealing with, you know. Suicide, big issue in Australia, 3,000 a year, like ends up being about 9 a day. 6 of those 9 are men. Now, they're about complex, all sorts of complex issues. A lot of them are around relationship breakups and unmanaged depression and also and alcohol and all sorts of other things. But, you know, look, it does come to this question about hope. And I mean, again, there's no magic wand. And I think a danger of going down that sort of plug hole of, oh my gosh, there's no hope, there's no future. One of the problems is people with severe mental health issues, or when they get too involved in it, they sort of have a tunnel vision. So just at that moment where you actually need to look at the bigger possibilities, the very opposite is true. Now, I don't have a solution for, you know, someone's feeling like that, other than some of the things we're talking about, and reconnecting and putting some of their energy into feeling that they're contributing to helping, being part of the solution. But before we move on to the next question, Anna or Kate, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on that one.
I just think in relation to, you know, dealing with somebody who's so distressed that they're suicidal. I think, I mean, I echo all of what you said, Grant, and that you know, sitting with somebody in the dark is really powerful. That we don't necessarily have to. Hope is important, but also meeting someone where they are and sitting with them in that dark place, I think, is also powerful as a means of connection compassionately. But hopefully, and I think, I guess, it's cognitive behavioral therapy principle around just working with a chink of a possibility that it might not all be terrible. That there is an element of the future that is unknown. No matter how dire their predictions are, we do not have a crystal ball, and we do not know exactly what will happen or how humanity will respond. And if people can acknowledge just a little chink of a possibility, I think that opens up a tiny window of hope. And that might be all you have, but that's a start. And you can climb out from there, potentially with the help of a supportive community and linking to like-minded people. Yeah.
And that if you are a person who can recognize the problem, then please be part of helping with the solution, you know, to try and activate that person to, you know, help make a positive impact, you know. And yeah, I go with that anyway. Yeah,
I think it's a great question. Obviously not a simple answer, but thanks. And I really like that idea of not, you know, not having to run in and go, no, don't worry, you know, like it sometimes is sitting with it. And a lot of people in that dark place, if you can get that little crack of light to start. A bit aware of your time, Kate. How did you want to manage your Q&A?
Yeah, we've got 10 more minutes. So what I really think is, can we get just a couple of quick responses? I think we've already talked a little bit about whether you're honest or direct, you know, when you're responding to what people think about the climate crisis. What I'd just like, there's one question I really wanted to ask or see to sort of flesh out a bit for a few minutes, and then we'll let you do your last bit, please, Grant. And that is, how do you help a 47-year-old coal miner who sees his $150,000 a year job going with his mortgages only half paid off, and supports a family with 2 teenage kids? And I suppose that's that thing about, you know, we have humans who are going to be in the fallout of changing to a renewable energy economy. You know, what do we say to these people who have a vested interest in the world remaining in the status quo? And, you know, you can recognise their need.
Yeah. Look, I mean, to some extent, you know, talking about knowing your piece of the puzzle, there will be smarter people than I at answering that, right? Because it is about societal transformation and how we may or may not compensate people. We have seen during COVID that when we want to, we can open up the gold and support people all sorts of ways. And I think, you know, if there are going to be losers, in which there inevitably will in these transformations, how does society manage that? But you're right. And I think GPs have got a great bullshit meter, right? And they're like, what's this guy going to do, right? When you say, hey, mate, don't worry, do CBT and we'll buy you a windmill. And he's like, thanks. You know, so I think that's really important. The only other thing I would say, which contributes to my hope budget, is I feel like that as doctors, we were standing at the end of the room yelling at a lot of other sectors in society going, hey, there's a problem here. We've got this climate issue. It's a real issue. It's a public health, population health issue. But, you know, the noise is coming from the business sector at the moment and the climate. You know, I saw the big report by McKinsey saying, we'll help you get to zero carbon. Some of it's going to be greenwashing, but there's so much actually palpably moving in the superannuation funds and the way in which Australia's being called out in an international way, that this has a different flavour, I think, to what's happened before. But your minor, I don't know exactly how we're going to help him. But
I think we need to get him politicised personally. I think we need to remind him that we need a political response to the climate crisis. And that, as you say, people can spend money on what they choose to spend. You know, and I think you've got something to say. And I do think we need to answer Leah's question briefly as well.
Yeah. If there's time just for a really quick comment, I would say I think that the plight of that minor speaks to the costs of inaction.
Yeah.
That, you know, we need the policy and government will to actually you know, create a pathway for people like this minor. And the longer we leave it and the less we do, the greater the costs are, and the mental health burden, because more people like this are going to get left behind if we don't actually take care of them. That's I'll wrap up there so we can get to the next question.
Yeah, and we'll go through this. And this is from Leah, and she's saying, we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are amongst the most impacted by the climate crisis already. Do we have any resources or research on mental health and the climate crisis the panel is aware of, specifically for or by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? I will just say before you answer that at our conference, the IDEA conference this October, Planet Health and Hope, we are having a section on ATSI health by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander panel members that will do a lot to answer that question for you, Leah. But either Anna or Grant, do you have any specific things that you're aware of? I must say I'm not.
If I just jump in quickly, I think it's a gap. I think it's a huge gap. I noticed in that data we were talking about earlier with Deacon, one of the breakdowns that I don't see in that data is the breakdown of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's responses were. You know, we know obviously that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are disproportionately affected through lots of different mechanisms around location, around social determinants of health as a result of colonisation and trauma. And it's a huge, huge gap.
Loss of country.
And loss of country. Locally in Tasmania, we have some programs run by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre that look at taking Aboriginal people back on country for connection to country in relation to their well-being. But in terms of evidence and research, I'm unaware. Grant?
Yeah, look, I believe there are some NHMRC projects that look at ATSI health and climate change. And so it is an important issue, but I don't have at the tip of my fingers exactly what's happening. But I agree, still a gap, lots more work to be done in that area.
Yeah.
I think where there is some research is on Native First Nations people in North America and Canada, in the Inuit communities around Solastalgia, loss of homelands, loss of traditional hunting. I think there is much more research in that population.
Hopefully we'll get some good answers at IDEA. So Grant, can you
just
give us the last pearls, Grant?
Yeah, like good GP, we'll try not to get too over time. Look, it's just great hearing the conversation and the questions. Let me just double check. We've got a few more minutes. If there's any other ones we can do quickly. If I can just go through some of these. Jim, should we as individual practitioners be living as our lives sustainably? I mean, yes is the answer. We did try and do a project called the Green Clinic. And I think just by the sheer number of general practices, that the more we can make our clinics sustainable. There's a green hospital movement as well. And I think in Victoria, if I've got it right, something like 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the health sector. There's a terrific fellow, Forbes McGain, who's been looking at that. Lizette, yes, definitely alternative to CBT, Liette, I should say. And I think Anna really just started to talk about a bit of that. So it's not all about, hey, let's just think differently, right? Like that would be shallow. And I think what Anna's been talking about, sitting with people and understanding their values is absolutely critical, and ACT sounds like a great thing to be talking about as well. Now, John's question, direct or indirect, when asked. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Everyone will have to have their own view on these. My view is that I try and balance my social engagements with my passion about this. What I mean is, if you're going out for dinner with a bunch of people and you decide you're going to make it a let's feel bad about the climate evening and drive everyone mad, it's probably not the right context. You know, on the other hand, what do you want to say in a professional context? I think it is good to bring it up, and it comes up, and we're all in various positions of power and influence where we can go, hey, you haven't thought about the climate issue here. So I think that's really important. I just check anonymous attendee, a lot of despair out there. You're not alone, anonymous attendee. We know it's very comforting to know that there's some very sane people out there also concerned. Just a couple of final comments then, if I might. I think, as I said at the start, we're GPs, we're used to not having all the answers to things, right? And we actually live clinically in quite a lot of uncertainty. And I think we do with this as well. I think our principle about linking with others is why organizations like DEA are so important. And we all bring different skills. I hope that, thinking about this, you can find that sweet spot between hope and despair. And if you are getting flat about it, knowing to back off for a while, and be kind to yourself and go, okay, I can't quite deal with all this at the moment. And that's okay too. But in the meantime, I think channeling that tremendous passion and fire that we've all got to continue to be an important voice. And I think that our bit of the puzzle is around, this is a health issue for us and for future generations. So just great to see the work from DEA, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Oh, that's lovely. Good on you, Grant. Thank you. And I just found that really fascinating. The grounded hope concept, I think, is the most helpful thing, to just know that, we aren't alone in this, and, we are agents of change, and the future isn't written. And so, we write the future, and let's write a good one, Anna, I think you might have something to say. And I wonder if Denise wants to say something.
100%. I think just as a closing comment from me around self-compassion and sustainability for us as activists, it's worth remembering that we are part of this planet that we care about and we seek to protect. And we need to care about ourselves as, we are part of this biosphere as well. And the planet needs us in it for the long game, because this problem is not going to be fixed quickly or easily. And so we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to those around us, if we're alive to this issue, to make sure that we can stay alive to this issue.
Beautiful.
So, yep.
Thank you, Anna. All right. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Denise, for all being here tonight and for having a conversation about what is such an important issue. Mental health and climate are kind of coupled well. They're great friends. The next After Hours webinar series is going to be on climate action for health professionals. That will be on Thursday, the 26th of next month. We'll have another panel discussion looking at what we all can do as health professionals and as humans alive on the planet. I think that's all I've got to say. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. All right.
Yeah.
Cheers.